The depths remember. The words echo almost symbolically at the end and beginning of every lesson that your tutor, Nalrin, instructs you. The massive wooden clock, its hands the limber tentacles of a kraken with detailed etchings, ticks and talks, almost hypnotizing young Katerina as she studies a wide variety of subjects, from mathematics, accounting, law, taxes, history, and even a small smattering of arcane theory, the latter of which was not part of the curriculum, but squeezed out of Nalrin in exchange for more earnest efforts in her studies. Currently, I'm hiding one of the books on arcane theory inside a larger, more boring book on taxes. I look up to see if Nalrin has noticed. The stern but fiercely loyal Nalrin looks down at the young Katerina, trying to hide her favorite small stolen leather book, marked with blue runes of gold and inlaid sapphires. A book worth several hundred gold pieces at least if it was on mundane subjects, but worth far more due to its insight into arcane secrets. Such a book evolved with one's understanding, as was its purpose, but the young lady had not quite perfected her skills of subterfuge. A quick tisk from his tongue, and he poked Katerina's head, a clear message of gentle disapproval. Perhaps you should focus your efforts on learning the heads of other noble houses instead of focusing on ledgers from our foreign estates. I hunch up my shoulders at being caught, and my lower lip extends into a pout as I slowly, sulkily put the not-so-hidden book back on the table. Perhaps if I focus more on my efforts on tap dancing, I'd be well equipped to run away and join the circus. The gaze of Nalrin becomes much more disapproving. You should not joke about such things, young lady. They are beneath you. You have duties to your family, your house, your people, and yourself. You have a destiny to fulfill, one way or another. He walks over to the bookcase, running his fingers down the spines as he often did, as he liked the lettering beneath his fingers. He glances back toward you. Circus or not. Feeling chided, I dropped my head into my folded hands and studiously ran my eyes down the page. But before long, I glanced up at my teacher, arranging my face into an appropriate expression of contrite. Please don't be mad, Nalrin. It's only that I feel like we've been here for hours, and I fear if I study much more, my head will explode. I rub my fingers against my temples to demonstrate my point. Nalrin turns around, leans in close, and smiles. She had been studying for a long time today, longer than usual, with fewer distractions than he typically expected. How about we do something just between us, How would you like to visit Rosa et Spindaspe? Nalrin raises an eyebrow, cleverly testing the young lady's skill with languages. I gasped, leaning out of the chair as if it had caught fire. The hope of Rosethorn Garden? Oh, can we? The most magnificent place in the entire city, the private garden was limited to the Sultan and his closest allies. However, some of the larger plants often poked through the bars of the fence for wanderers to enjoy. I would study for an hour if it meant I could spend a minute running my fingers across their soft petals. Nalrin smiled, pleased at her recollection. Of course, my young lady. It will just be between us two, of course. Quickly, pack away your favorite book. I know a small, quiet spot that we might be able to stay for an hour or so and read among the flowers. I clasped my hands over my mouth to contain a shriek of delight and snatched the book on arcane theory up off the table. I tucked it into my belt and ran over to Nalrin, bouncing up and down on my toes as though I could take flight if I tried hard enough. Ready? I said in a loud whisper, trying to keep our journey a secret. Nalrin chuckles. She's predictable as always. Nalrin leads the young lady towards the front door, and after a brief carriage ride under the guise of educational tour of the city, Nalrin leans into the driver and instructs him to take you both to the garden. The driver is not thrilled, but complies. After a few agonizing minutes of delay, the impatient young Katerina begins to smell the telltale scent of rose flowers drifting from the iron gates. For the beginning of the carriage ride, my feet are tapping the floor impatiently until I remember my etiquette lessons. It takes a large amount of self-control, but I manage to fold my hands into my lap and tuck one ankle under the other, working hard to produce an image of decorum. It is all almost for nothing when the gates become visible outside the window, flowers growing tantalizing vines around the bars, just begging to be admired. I was so focused on keeping the rest of my body still that it took me a moment to realize that my teeth were chattering with excitement as the floral perfumes began to creep inside the carriage window, tickling my nose. I had never wanted anything as much as I wanted to follow Nalrin to the quiet spot he knew of and stay there forever. I wanted to lie down in the dirt and sleep as roots grew out of my feet and flower petals burst from my chest. But I wanted to finish my book first. The scent of fresh roses is mixed with something unexpected, something told of in stories but never happens here, something strange, beyond beautiful. The mix is a scent of something impossible. The sky begins to blot out and show an unnatural shade through the window of the private carriage. The driver, out front without a cover, begins to curse under his breath, much to the disapproval of Naran, who believes that young ladies should not hear such things. As rain begins to fall, the telltale pitter-patter of rain hitting the top of the carriage would serve to drive an unusual excitement, like charged clouds with no thunder, a spark ready to set off a chain reaction. Naran had not seen rain since he himself was a young child, barely 30 years of age. The pleasant surprise and welcoming, damp mist wafting on the air would usually be calming. But Naran knew better. It would be impossible to go inside of the gates and turn around without an explosion from the young lady. Best he could do would be to enter as swiftly and quietly as possible, spend some time, then come up with an excuse to leave. The carriage came to a halt at an entrance, a side gate. The old iron locks would soon be rusted, unaccustomed to the rain. His key would not work in the future. The slick sound of wet wooden wheels coming to a halt near a puddle and light mud with the color of charcoal made it clear that it would be a messy walk. Naran stepped out, and, as is custom, opened the door for the young lady, who was quite impatient to go out into the first rain of her young life. He gestured for her to wait, and the chains around his right fingers appeared, twisted like the spines of a serpent. The face of a dragon's head appeared on one end, and with a bead of blood, he weaved a spell. A sheen of light that left shadows arose around them, in the shape of an umbrella. Similarly, after drawing his fingers that bled a straight line to the gate, a small, almost imperceivable field of blue light coated the ground, protecting the young lady's feet and clothes from the dirt and mud. The sheen was mesmerizing, like slick oil on the ground, but firm and clean, and sparkled like an echo of a forgotten star. Naran customarily bowed and gestured for her to take his hand, all while wondering if she would remember proper decorum. I watched with wide eyes as Naran's chain spun around his fingers in a mesmerizing pattern. When he finished and stepped aside, reaching out a hand, I ignored it and jumped full force into the mud below, expecting it to splash and leave exciting stains on my teacher in the carriage. I was foiled, however, with the ground firm and unforgiving beneath my feet in spite of its muddy texture. Thwarted, I instead turned my face up to the rain, basking in the feeling of small drops hitting my face, one by one, and rolling down my cheeks. It was like crying without the sad feelings. But before even a handful of seconds had passed, Naran had moved his hands and the shape of an umbrella moved over my head, blocking any further contact with the rain. I wanted to pout, but I also didn't want to risk returning home before I had seen the garden, so adopted the correct posture. Clasping my hands in front of me, "I'm ready," I announced, as though I hadn't intended to go jump through the mud puddles a mere seconds ago. Naran smiles to himself, having easily predicted her behavior. He was not surprised in the slightest. With a tiny weave of his finger, a small slit appears in the umbrella above her, allowing an occasional bead of raindrop pierce an angle of the shield and touch her face. A small amount of moisture would not ruin her composure too much. As they approached the side gate, Naran produced a key with a weave of his hand. Contained spaces was a spell few knew, and it was very useful. He would teach it to the young lady once he felt she matured enough. Being able to summon and dismiss objects was a very powerful ability, and might often be misused. Of course, only certain people could cast it, since it was an origin spell. Still, the young lady had an early, eager interest in arcane theory. Unfortunately for her, her father was very particular on her course of study to take. He wanted her to take over the household and manage the accounts, not go off exploring. Naran had not yet convinced him totally to allow him to teach her defensive spells, but he thought he was close. Proof against detection and charms were useful since her blood only gave her so much protection from it. Still, he belonged to the house, in more ways than one. He put the key inside the locked gate and opened it to reveal a small cobbled path, littered with a variety of luminous flowers carefully maintained and curated. The smells of many different kinds of plants wafted through the air to mix with the mist of fresh rain. You could almost hear the starved plants drinking freely of their thirst for the first time in their lives. Such an event was dangerous, yes, The beam that was in the sky while young Katerina was in the carriage was concerning. He might have to make a report to the master regarding it, but alas, affairs to deal with another time. Come, young lady, I shall lead the way. There is a small gazebo made of fascinating stone, almost grown from living crystals. It is small, barely 5 feet tall, but I think you will find it fits you quite nicely. I blinked the annoyance out of my eyes. I always made an effort to watch his hands like a hawk when he used magic, trying to figure out how he could store an apparently infinite amount of objects in his long sleeves, but his fingers always moved too quick for me to pick up on it. Determined to not let it ruin the outing, I delicately picked up my skirts and threw back my shoulders, following Nalrin into the garden. I tried to walk like I was floating, the way my etiquette tutor was always saying, but I feared I looked ridiculous instead. I snuck a glance at Nalrin to see if he was laughing at me, but his face was serene as always. The occasional raindrop hitting my cheeks made me tilt my head back up to look at the stormy sky, filled with towering clouds. I'd never seen any kind of rain before, only read about it in science books. It made me feel very small, as though at any moment the clouds could darken and release a flood, sweeping away Nalrin and I, the gardens, and even the whole of Osriel. I kept my eyes on the clouds. I asked suspiciously, how can crystals be alive? I thought it might be another one of his tricks, like the pointy-teethed fairies he claimed would take me away if I didn't finish my dinner. Nalrin added an extra, unnecessary flourish to his motions as he noticed the young lady's scrupulous gaze. She is destined to be a perceptive one, that much is for sure. It seemed to him that she was always aware of her surroundings and predestined to know more than she revealed. Alas, such is the fate for one such as she. Nalrin leaned down and smiled, looking the young lady in the eye. She always appreciated when you were honest with her, but she loved it even more when you gave her a small hint of mystery for her to unravel. You should purchase some puzzles for her to solve. Such things can serve as a reward for good studies, and, secretly, a way to train her mind to open the seals within. Crystals are funny that way. Some say they grow upon the dew of unanswered questions. Nalrin led the way for a couple of minutes through the garden until they reached a lush crossroads of a kind. There were numerous tall plants basking in the newfound moisture, glistening like the refraction of a new sun. He turned around and offered his hand to the young lady, who so graciously, if reluctantly, took it and stepped up a small garden wall. Then, through an interweaving of plants, with an occasional spin of spider thread, they came to a kind of small clearing, in between large glass-like leaves, taller than a man, offering a kind of unique seclusion to be had nowhere else. At the far edge, a small gazebo, not even 5 feet tall, almost seemed to perfectly fit the young lady. Its stone was that of a sparkling granite, who seemed to soak in the rain like fresh tears upon labored soil. It sparkled and shined as if it was filled with thousands of tiny diamonds. In the center of the small structure was an altar and a bowl, with a small pool of luminescent liquid. It housed a plant growing from its clear waters, a strange and unique flower, a white lotus that seemed to glisten in the sparkling light like it had always belonged. From its leaves, drops of water like dew dripped at a constant rhythm, almost hypnotically. At its base, in the shape of a surrounding ring beneath the pool, lie words carved of strange origin. The language was unknown to Katerina, yet it was eerily familiar. Nalrin leans down next to the young lady and watches her movements closely. He noticed that she even started her spell casting with a telltale flick of her finger, one that he himself used to steady one of his chains. The motion of fingers for the spell is complex for one of her years, but in the grand scheme of spellcasting, not hard to do. Revelia mihi abscondita tua. Reveal unto me your secrets. Nalrin nodded, noticing her formula. He had not taught her to cast this spell. She must have managed to decipher it from a book. It could, theoretically, have been inside the book of an arcane theory, but he found that hard to believe. She might have found another book, but he had thought they were accounted for. No, she might have an understanding of spell work beyond her years, but he thought that something else must be at play. In the meantime, he would do his best to guide her gift. He had always thought it was good she had an interest in magical arts. After all, in their line of work, having a baseline of how spells function was an important tool. At one point, he thought she might study to become a true witch of her own, perhaps drawing upon a magic within? No, something else. Something else is going on. Whether this influence was malign or benevolent, he would have to watch her even more closely from now on. Very good, my young lady. It appears your self-studies have progressed further than I thought. As she finishes her primitive incantation, the words around the plinth begin to grow with a soft blue light, shimmering like ice. The words entered her mind, and she knew what they said. For Penelope. For Mercy. I felt a shiver of pride go through me, standing up straighter at Nalrin's praise. The flower was beautiful, its petals white as paper, small droplets of water on its surface glistening softly. But as I translated the meaning of the phrase at the bottom of the bowl, I found questions instead of answers. I lifted my chin, attempting to make myself look imperious the way Father did, and pointed at the words. Tell me, Narrin, who is Penelope? Nalrin looked sad for a moment. Someone who was lost, and then found. Lost again. Nalrin responds, I am afraid it is not my place to tell, young lady. The words echo through the cold chamber, now tinted with a hint of frost. The chill from the rain plummeting ahead threatened to soak Nalrin, so he reluctantly ducked into the gazebo and leaned his head and back against the cold stone and closed his eyes. The pitter-patter of rain against the stone was akin to cobblestone, and the occasional splash would land from puddle overflows. In the distance, some small yelling and commotion occurred. Probably a traffic accident. We shall rest here for a time. You may read as you wish. Some small time later, maybe 20 minutes, and their quiet solitude was interrupted by the telltale sound of heavy boots crunching wet gravel. And a hand with many rings ran its fingers through the flowers, concealing them. Annoyed that Nalrin knew and would not tell me, I settled for seating on the gazebo floor and pulling out the book on arcane theory. After a few minutes, it became hard to stay focused, the pattering of the rain providing a comfort background of white noise. I was unaccustomed to this kind of cold, the kind that crept into my bones and made my nose ache. Before very long, my hands were shivering ever so slightly. I had to lock my jaw to keep my teeth from chattering. I much preferred warm, sunny days when I could stretch out on a blanket outside the house, roll up my sleeves, and let the sunlight soak into my skin. I was rapidly coming to the decision that rain was much better enjoyed through a window, wrapped in thick blankets. My ears pricked at the sound of footsteps, my concentration fleeting as I shut the book and stood next to my teacher. They were closer now, louder, and I saw a single hand covered in rings emerge into view. I gave Narrin's sleeve a brief tug and pointed at it, suddenly afraid to speak out loud. Nalrin opened his eyes to the tugging and saw the fingers wafting through the plants. Alarmed, he looked down at Katarina and made a symbol. 2 fingers stretched, the rest curled, and he placed them against his lips. A symbol trained and taught to her. Get down and be quiet. The number of fingers used to indicate the level of danger. 1 is none. 2 is high. 3 is run. He took his 2 fingers and without uttering a word did a strange drifting motion. His chains disappeared on his fingers and in their place were 3 small fiery balls, spinning quickly and silently. Every second more and more balls appeared. Katarina had never seen this spell cast before, but even with her limited knowledge would know that it was particularly dangerous. And it was even more odd that he did not need to recite words to cast his spell. The hand retreated, and Nalrin started to relax until he heard a thump and saw a boot. Covered in a small layer of smear mud, stepping in a small shelf, they found themselves hiding. A face appeared, and as quick as thought, Nalrin twisted his hand, and the balls disappeared in a puff of smoke. So quickly it was as if they never existed, and the chains reappeared just as quickly as the man entered their little clearing. My lord, it is a strange evening to be seeing you here. Nalrin nods, showing deep respect. An elderly man, obviously some high noble, but one she did not recognize, looked to be a little more than a mess of wrinkles and political force incarnate to the young Katarina. When he saw the 2 of you, at first he was confused, then he looked like he might get angry, until he laid his eyes on the young lady, where he then reverted to a kind smile. Ah yes, I was just perusing this garden, of course, as I am wont to do. I see you found a small shrine. I myself thought I would have gotten outside the rain while being able to listen and relax. I see that this one is occupied. Nevertheless, there are others. The man looks at the young lady and smiles again and nods his head respectively. Who might this wonderful young lady be, I wonder? He leans his head down formally with a palm open and loose towards Katerina, clearly expecting an introduction. I dipped a shallow curtsy, acknowledging him as a fellow member of the nobility. I am Katerina of House Beltan. Pleasure to make your acquaintance, my lord. I racked my brain trying to place him in one of the noble families for my studies, but I came up blank. The noble gently takes the hand of the young lady, as was custom, and gently pecks at the back of her hand in the shine of respect. It is a pleasure, to be sure, my lady. I have watched your progress with great interest. I trust you will continue to learn great things from many subjects. The man nodded at Nalrin before giving another kind smile to the young lady. Give my regards to your master, Nalrin. Nalrin nods almost obediently as the man walks out of the clearing, landing rough on the path of cobbled stone, making wet marching sounds as he walked down the path, whistling a familiar tune, almost like a forgotten lullaby, as the rain assaulted the rich leather cloaks draped around him. The rain seemed to grow louder, pressing in on my ears, and I hastily closed my mouth upon realizing it was slightly open, as the man left an enormous pressure seemed to go with him, one I hadn't even noticed until it was gone. In its place, I felt a creeping sense of unease. Strictly speaking, I wasn't sure we were allowed to be here, not the way the other man was. Plausible deniability only worked if nobody was around to contradict you. Nalrin, I worked hard not to let my voice slip, but still the tiniest bit of trepidation stuck through. I don't recognize that man. Should we be concerned about him? Nalrin leans back against the tiny shelter with a small amount of visual relief, though to one who knows him, the obvious tension in his shoulders reveals a palpable anxiety. He replied, seemingly trying to soothe the young lady. He is a man of importance, someone who has taken an interest in you for a long time. He was once interested in your sister as well, but I think he has shifted that attention to you. I believe this happened even before she was sent to another estate for education. The young lady's sister, while not an heir, was being tutored long-term by a cousin of the main family. It was important that she be educated, both for the appearance of the house and to be able to attract suitors and eventually handle various affairs of state. Men in this era rarely learned to read and write, and preferring their wives to handle such matters for them, though in high society it wasn't unheard of for a man to do woman's work. It was still considered polite to allow her to do such things publicly and in polite company. Johanna was proving to be very adept at numbers and shrewd in accounts, which led to some in the family quietly question if it really were the best that she had been born second. Nalrin closes his eyes and listens to the pitter-patter of the rain, soft but voracious. The drops may be random, but they seem to create a melody capable of calming worries and soothing anxiety. Nalrin takes a few minutes and after a while opens his eyes, wet from the rain and his hair cascading down. He pulls out his fingers to cast yet another spell. This time, he did utter an incantation and conjured his chains and formulated his spells using complex, interwoven motions. The magic was strange to Katerina, and she was not yet sure she knew what it was or what it meant. Hyacinthum papillions iventutus et cincius. The final motion had his fingers flat and outreached, as a blue light sparkled on the top of his index finger. The light coalesced and formed an image of something haunting and beautiful, an image of a truth yet to come, and a treasure revealed in the past, an image of a wonderful blue butterfly. The butterfly grew and sparkled, and soon there were several to begin to fly that from his finger into the air. They spun around, rapidly flapping their wings, and seemed to have an almost arcane agility to them. Another flourish of his motions, and the butterflies were off, scattering among the garden. Nalrin spoke, his concerns seemingly alleviated, at least for now. These shall serve to keep an eye out for anyone else, and they should blend in. Eventually, the charm will release them, and they will live and nourish among the garden forever. Not the first to do so, I know, but one that I hope is more pleasant in their fate. Nalrin looked down at the young lady and asks, Are you worried, my young charge? I noticed a small hint of trepidation in your speech. Fear not, for while there are many who would be harmed, I think you would not be, for what it's worth. Narin gestures for Katerina to come to him and lay next to him, as they have done before. To others, their relationship were as charge and student, but he had always thought of her as his sister, and cared for her more than most. He knew some secrets were better left close to chest, but he could not help humming a lullaby he himself loved when he was her age. A lullaby of love and hunting loss. A loss of something dear, precious, so precious as to be something intrinsic to your being, something that makes you partially of who you really are. The lullaby speaks of losing such a thing, and a memory of what it was being fleeting. Such a song was a comfort, and perhaps could help young Katerina forget bad dreams. He himself wished it worked on him, for he had dreams he knew would come true. Dreams of a sacrifice yet to come, for the greater good of his charge, and for us all. I lifted on my tiptoes and reached out my hands, watching as the butterflies spread out, wings glowing faintly in the rain. At my teacher's request, I went to lay down next to him, resting my head on the soft plants that covered the ground and wrinkled my nose. What makes our family so special? And then a rather unhappy thought crossed my mind. He doesn't want to marry me, does he? Narin coughed as he seemingly conjured a small wooden pipe filled with tobacco. Imported from afar, it was very expensive and hard to come by, even here. His coughing fit continued for several minutes as if he had bronchitis. Finally, he took a deep breath and replied, No, my young lady, not at all. Nothing like that. Narin added, I think it is merely a result of wishing gone too far. In any case, I believe he knows his duty is to keep you at a distance. Even though he could make certain claims, he doesn't, thought Narin. He continued, Now, would you like to learn a spell? If you can tell me the name of the lowest class of spell work, I will endeavor to teach you one. I snapped to attention and struck my hand straight up in the air. A cantrip! Narin smiled and replied, Very good. We will start learning a cantrip called Prestidigitation. We can't practice it very often, but we can do so whenever we come to this garden. Narin begins to create exaggerated movements of his fingers and carefully orates the spell, and then his damp clothes become dry once more. Now, you try. I didn't dare blink my eyes as I carefully copied his motions, sounding out the words very slowly, determined to get it right. Maybe if I proved to be adept at magic, I would be allowed to do more of it. As I finished the incantation, a small shower of orange sparks manifested between my hands and I gasped. Did you see that? I demanded. Without waiting for an answer, I cast the cantrip again and again, trying to make sparks of any color I could think of. Narin chuckles as he waves a pinky. Katerina's spell fizzles instantly. Shh, careful regarding magic that makes noise. Some wards are more precise than others. Narin looked up at the sky and the falling rain. He had a prodigy in his hands, all right, though he suspected what magic she might possess wouldn't be her own. Narin took the time to educate the young Katerina on the mental tools needed to prepare spells for memorization and manifestation. One of many lessons in this regard, and an hour would quickly grow late as evening set upon them in the storm. After a time, the rain lifted, and they prepared to disembark. They heard footsteps on the path near them, 2 sets, one much smaller than the other. The spell died on my fingers, and I inhaled sharply, ready to voice a protest. Before I could, Narin set about teaching me more about magic, helping me understand the basics, how to take desire and determination and produce extraordinary effects. After a time, the rain ceased, and Narin began to lead me back the way we came. But before we could get very far, I heard the crunch of gravel underfoot as 2 individuals drew near. The rain has stopped, but moisture still hangs in the air and whisks off stone and plants alike. Narin reaches for the young lady and pulls her aside, and motions for her to be still and very quiet. He does another motion, and once more he does not need to mutter to work magic. Katerina observes an unusual film in front of her, and Narin grabs her hand before she can undo the mask. Sure enough, the steps grow louder as they come closer. One is much heavier than the other, one skipping and jumping as if in childlike joy. They stop in front of them, in the middle of the path. I do not see them. The man is older and different than before. Please tell me. It is what I have come to see you for, and risks so much. The man is fat and plump and wears large brown robes. He finally stops and almost drags the young girl to a standstill. She is a stranger to the young Katerina, and the shimmering reflection makes it difficult to make out her face and appearance. She replies in a tone almost carefree, but dark in implication. To have a child is to give the fates a hostage. And she happily played and walked down the path deeper into the garden, while the broken man before them cried more tears than the river Styx. After a long time, he managed to pick himself up, the dirt and mud caking where he fell on his knees for quite some time. I waited with bated breath as the man cries before me. He was no one I'd ever seen before. I wanted to emerge from where Nalrin was hiding us and ask the man why he was crying and try to help. But I trusted my teacher. If Nalrin was keeping me here, then I would not reveal myself. Eventually, he stood, his outline wobbling through the film in front of me, and resumed his journey down the path. Still wary, I stood up on my tiptoes and pulled Nalrin down so his head was level with mine. Who were they? One is a fool, another is one I would not trifle with. The two may often be confused, but not here. Nalrin spoke with little formality, which was unusual for him. To him in the garden and then be all but given unofficial license was one thing. To disrupt fate was another. Nalrin was not a particularly devout man. He had been raised as a Stewart since birth, and Stewarts were not allowed a religion. They were to serve, no more, no less. And he even had to conjure his chains he used for spell work, as some more learned nobility might learn he served the Redeemers. His voice spoke of caution and muffled secrets. He gestured to a bend around the path and to the iron gate that they used to enter. Nalrin conjured his key as he used to, and gestured for the young lady to follow him to the carriage. Pouting slightly as I felt the limits of my authority over Nalrin, I followed him back to where the carriage was waiting. He got in these moods sometimes where he refused to give straight answers and muttered about fate or destiny, boring, antiquated topics. Sometimes I tried to argue with him about the futility of subscribing to determinism, but he always just got this sad look in his eyes that took the wind right out of my sails. My thoughts turned instead to the brief dialogue I'd overheard while hidden. I didn't recognize either of them through the film, but the girl had looked straight at me, with eyes white like marble. It was strange how she hadn't seemed to give the man a helpful answer, but her words had still devastated him. I wondered what he wanted to know so desperately. Nalrin guides the young lady into the carriage and gives his man a small brown pouch, a bonus for loyalty and discretion in the day's events. Worried, he sits inside as it wheels around to bring them back to the estate. Nalrin says, "Tell me, what do you think of our city? Use everything I and your other tutors have taught you, between decorum, etiquette, economy, politics, and trade. What do you think? Where does true power lie?" Nalrin was concerned, but outwardly relaxed back into his role as steward, a calm, educational, fair, but hard teacher, condemning lack of effort while praising ambition. I wrinkled my nose and lifted my chin, trying to channel Johanna's effortless composure as I quickly attempted to recall what I knew about Osriel politics. I knew slavery was rampant and that my parents were trying to stop it. I suspected this made us very unpopular with the other nobles who made money off procuring and selling slaves illegally. My parents were smart and brave, and my family was respected, but from conversations I sometimes managed to overhear, I knew they were trying to swim against an impossibly strong current. "Power lies with those who least deserve it," I said darkly, "and it takes time to change anything for the better." I had a rather cynical view of politics, and little patience for people who disagreed with me. Sometimes I wished everyone else would just disappear and that my family could be totally in charge. But when I voiced this to my father once before, he had smiled and said some things weren't worth wasting wishes on. Nalrin chuckled softly, finally some tension releasing from his shoulders. "Firm spirit as always, my young lady. But no, not really. Power isn't in the hands of those who least deserve it. True power is not in the hands that gather it. The people are the greatest force for good and ill the world has ever known, for it is in their belief, their intention, that powers the great forces that move around the world. Without the people, those great forces would wither away and be lost, forgotten." I quashed the urge to fold my arms. People are powerful only when united in service of their goals. Lots of people are wrapped up in their own personal problems, too busy working to make it to the next week, to worry about what they want this city to look like in the next decade. When I was younger and just starting etiquette lessons, my teacher had me walk around for hours with a book on my head. If I managed to make it all day without dropping the book, I was allowed to read it, even if it wasn't one of my approved subjects. Etiquette lessons I previously would have sold my left arm to get out of became an occasion to look forward to, a chance to read up on material I had never been allowed near otherwise. It wasn't until I could spend an entire day with 5 separate books on my head without blinking that I realized how easy I'd been manipulated. I suspected I was far from the easiest person to manipulate, but I'd been easily strung along. That was to say, people with more fervent problems, more immediate desires, weren't even easier to steer along certain paths. Nalrin nods, considering. Traditional forms of power, perhaps, but not here. Nalrin smiles and asks, "What proper topics would you prefer to study when we get back?" I considered my options carefully. Most proper topics were not taught in very interesting lessons. Instead of giving me reading material, my teachers would simply lecture me for hours on end while I took barely legible notes. But Naren seemed to be in an indulgent mood today, and so I decided to press my luck. I would like to practice some dancing when we return. It's been ages since my last lesson. Bemused, Naren chuckled to himself. I have not danced in a good long while myself, though I was educated in the craft as your head tutor. Nalrin was interrupted as a small translucent butterfly returned to him and found its way onto his wrist. He turned his wrist around him and the butterfly disappeared, almost like a mirage. Nalrin quickly covered up his new mark with his sleeve as he pulled out a small rolled-up parchment. It is a good thing you asked, my young lady, as the first ball of the season is set to take place later this week. We shall be sure to have you fitted for a new dress and accompanying shoes. I am sure shopping will be a lot of fun. You will, of course, be required to touch upon your etiquette, as I am sure there are things you wish to iron out to avoid an embarrassment on such an important occasion. I whipped my head around from staring out the window to staring at the new invitation in Nalrin's hand. My immediate instinct was to reach out and yell, "Give!" before years of behavioral lessons kicked in and I crossed my ankles. "A new dress," I said dreamily, already imagining the feeling of soft fabric along my skin. I tilted my head to the side, analyzing my teacher as the second half of his comment settled in. "I would never embarrass myself at such an event," I said severely. "I will be the picture of intelligence and grace. Just wait and see." Although I wasn't sure if he could see actually, with this being the first ball I was attending since coming of age, I realized I didn't know if Nalrin would still accompany me as a chaperone. A slight pang of loneliness went through me at the idea. Nalrin noticed her look of disappointment and responded, "I will, of course, be your escort. I will shift from something of a chaperone and more of a guide. I will be mostly responsible for dealing with the riffraff and ensuring that you are treated with the utmost decorum." Nalrin nods, and a slight darkness hints at a glint behind his eyes. "I simply cannot abide rude behavior towards my charges." Nalrin smiles again, the look disappearing as quickly as it arrived. "Of course, you may be expected to dance and answer questions for suitable suitors. Normally, it would not be unusual for you to decline such requests, but given that it coincides with your birthday, I suspect that your father will request a formal dance. But I am sure we can get you up to speed fairly quickly in regards to your dancing performance. And if all fails, I know a few tricks to make it easy to get by in the meantime should you fail to learn." I felt a pleasurable warmth in my heart to be assured that Nalrin would be with me still, but I stuck out my bottom lip at the implication that I might not be able to hold my own on a dance floor. "I'm sure it will come back to me in no time," I said huffily. "I may not be as fast as Johanna with numbers, but my footwork can dance circles around hers." This was perhaps a slight exaggeration, but Johanna never really applied herself to dance lessons, so I outpaced her without too much difficulty. I didn't entertain the possibility that if she did put in effort, she'd best me in dance too. Nalrin chuckled as he put the thin, rolled-up piece of paper away. "We should be arriving at the manor any minute. If your father asks, you were learning about local landmarks, and we were interrupted by the rain." A few more minutes passed, and the carriage took a familiar turn into more rigid cobblestone streets, and sure enough, the wide mansion in the gloom was visible as they crested a hill. I tossed back my hair and smiled. I can keep a secret, Nalrin, I said confidently and turned my gaze back to the window. Home seemed emptier and emptier these days, the longer I went without William and Johanna's company. Nobody to sneak into the kitchens after dark with, nobody to help me with economic theory lessons, nobody to share blame with when I accidentally broke a decades-old vase. Still, I tried to put it out of my mind and focus my thoughts on happier things, like my birthday, and the dance, and the magic Nalrin taught me. I snuck a glance at him and tried to stealthily cast the prestidigitation cantrip, making the faint scent of garden flowers fill the air around us. The scent of flowers briefly lit the air with a sense of new life. She was learning, yes. Nalrin knew how such circumstances affected her. He did what he could to shield her, but he had obligations, both within and without. In any case, he would need to deliver word of his discovery to his master very soon. He would want to learn regarding the frozen objects report. Progress. Though make sure you are being subtle and choosy when and where you cast spells. Perhaps one day when you learn enough spell work, I might teach you the graceful art of subtle spells. Quite handy, those. I primly fold my hands in my lap up until the carriage fully stops, and I exit after my teacher, taking Nalrin's offered hand. I keep my shoulders back as I walk into the house, seeking my parents, already planning ways to prove I'm worthy of learning subtle spells. The carriage comes to a stop, and Nalrin assists the young lady out, as she had long grown accustomed to. Her hand was slightly pale and damp. From stress or rain, it would be hard to say. As she landed, he quickly remedied it using a most basic of cantrips, and once again using a trick he mastered, pulled out what appeared to be a dozen of scrolls, bundles of maps. Nalrin cleared his throat, then asked unnecessarily loud, "Are you sure you need all of these maps, my young lady? Surely the ones inside the house would be suffice to educate you on the lands abound of our state and that of our neighbors. But I suppose your dedication to your learning is a key to your eager success." Nalrin gave a subtle wink to the young lady when she looked back at him. The man-sized shadow staring down through the windows in the study at the top of the tower studied them as they entered the house. I swallowed a smile and answered in the same volume. "My dedication to my studies is second to none. I'm afraid every single map is necessary if I'm to truly understand our local landmarks." I knew without needing to glance that father was looking down upon us, and kept my head high as we entered the house, my head swirling with the thoughts of the dance and what my dress would look like, and if many suitors would ask me to dance. My fingers tapped out a simple rhythm on Nalrin's arm as I wondered if I could begin preparations today, or if I would have to wait until tomorrow. Nalrin smiled and nodded, and gestured for the young lady to enter her chambers on the second floor. "I will have your preferred meal waiting for you, my young lady. I will have these in your study chambers in the library. Until dinner tonight, you are free to do as you wish. I believe your father requests your presence later in this evening." Free time, with no compelled lessons or obligations, a rarity indeed. In the past, she would spend such times playing with her siblings, but the mostly empty house still perhaps offered secrets yet undiscovered.